In this video, we're going to cover some of the fundamental concepts, including the title of the course, Information and Interaction Design, what does it mean, and also the general concept of UX design. So let's go over the course title real quick. It has two components, and the first one is Information Design. And in the field of user experience design or UX design, information refers to the practice of organizing and representing information to facilitate understanding, navigation, and use. So it's not about making things look good, it's about helping users make a sense of complex information through structure or layout or language. Okay? So let's say we're designing a sign-up page for a newsletter. Then we might be tempted to collect a lot of information from the user, including their name, their job or occupation, their telephone number, email address, and more. But we have to think, do we really need all that information? And if we do we have to have all that information up front or at the beginning? Like, what about the phone number? It's not likely something that's necessary at this stage. So maybe just an email address is fine just to get them started. So good information design in this case includes first asking for the right information at the right time and then organizing it into different categories. So maybe personal information, account setting information, stuff like that. And lastly, presenting it clearly at appropriate times in an appropriate manner, okay? So that's information design. Good interaction design is about designing appropriate mechanisms for accessing and manipulating task information. So continuing with our example from before, let's say we decide to ask for a phone number. Then the interaction design asks, how will the users enter this information or provide that information? Will that be a single input point? Or does it automatically format or configure the number as they're entering it? You might have seen systems where you enter a number and they automatically add the dashes in between, stuff like that. And will it validate the country code or the area code automatically? Okay, so now, hopefully, you can distinguish between information design and interaction design. So now that we've covered the basics of information and interaction design, let's take a step back and look at how this fits into the bigger picture of UX design or user experience design. So here's a typical UX lifecycle. And actually next week we'll be diving more into the lifecycle, but for today, let's just get a quick overview. So the UX lifecycle is about the process that's used to create products that are usable, useful, and desirable. And first, we start by defining a topic or a problem that we're going to look at. And then in the research phase, you observe the users. So maybe you're observing them in the workplace, or maybe you're watching people as they use existing products, or maybe you have them come in to talk about their current experience. So, you're trying to figure out what are their current needs or pain points or challenges. And after you figure that out, you have the general idea of what people want. You generate ideas to tackle the problems that you found through research. And then you create prototypes, and then you test them. And basically, you repeat this process until you have an effective design. So there are many different versions of this life cycle with slightly different groupings and namings. So actually, the one that we'll focus on or use throughout this course has a slightly different name where it groups all of this into one category and calls it analysis. And then another phase, which is called the design phase. But the general structure, is roughly the same. So as a designer, you might think, why do we need all these phases? Especially the early phases. Why can't we just pick a topic and then go to prototyping and then test the prototype? Here's a famous example about user experience versus the design. So what do you notice about this picture? There was the intended design, the pathway going at a right angle, but you see that the user experience or the shortcut doesn't match the intended design. So we call this a workaround or a desire path. And when you see things like that, that means the design doesn't really match people's goals or needs. And when we see these desire paths emerge, we definitely want to reconfigure or redesign the system that supports their needs. And that's why we want to first observe and study how they behave or what they want to do, and then design accordingly. This is Don Norman, who is a key figure in UX design, and I'll be referring to a lot of his ideas throughout this course. And in his book, he starts off by talking about all his years in industry, and he usually gets hired by companies to work on some specific task, but oftentimes it works out that he doesn't actually work on that task because the people need, or what the people want, or how they were struggling was different from what people who hired him thought that the users wanted. So actually he spends a lot of time and effort doing user research, conducting contextual inquiries, and we'll be talking about all of that in this course. So all that to say that there are two parts of UX design. And the first goal or first part is to design the right product. So to do that, we have to know who are we designing for, and what are they currently doing, and what do they ultimately want to do. And we'll go through different topics related to these things, including creating persona, doing a contextual inquiry, and then doing a scenario-based design or storytelling through scenarios. Regarding the research part of the UX design process, Don Norman famously said that a brilliant solution to the wrong problem can be worse than no solution at all. In other words, solve the correct problem. So why did he say that, and why is it actually worse than no solution? Well, because creating a product takes time and energy and lots of money. So why design and implement and create a product that no one will use, or maybe even makes it more complicated to use? So only after you have identified the right product should you move on to goal number 2, which is to design the product right. So to do that, we're going to do a lot of sketching and some prototyping, and then usually once we have a prototype, we'll do usability testing. But for this course, we're actually only going to go up to the prototyping phase because you'll do a lot of evaluation work in HCIN 630. So we have a whole different course for that. Now, here's an overview of the two things we talked about. So this is called the double diamonds diagram, and it shows the diverging phases. So we're going to come up with a lot of different insights or ideas of what they're currently doing. And then we're going to narrow down the scope. So, what is the actual problem that we'll be solving? And same for the design phase, we're going to ideate. And then we're going to generate lots of different ideas to address the problem. And then we're going to converge and narrow it down to the specific prototype or the specific design. So we need all of that, or all this work, because way back when people started making tools, they were both designer and user. So they knew exactly what they wanted. And if something they created didn't exactly fix their problem, they could always tinker and change it to fit their needs. But now it's different. Today, designers, that'd be us, we're pretty far from the user, both physically and knowledge-wise. So maybe we're designing something for people like, halfway around the world. And also, what we know is going to be very different from what the users know. So keep in mind, you are not your user, and that's rule number 1 in UX design. And I really can't emphasize this enough, because oftentimes it's so easy to assume that how you use an app or how you use a design is how the users will too. But study after study shows that that's not the case. So we'll need to talk with actual users and observe their preferences and how they're using it and their frustrations about using the product. And you might think, hey, but I'm a user too. But that's different, because you're just one sample and you probably know the system a lot better than your users do. So we're going to learn a lot about how to talk with users and how to find out what they want in this class. Interaction design and information design are two of the methods or kind of the tools regarding user-centered design or UX design. And there are many different views and methodologies on the UX design process. So we're actually going to touch on a lot of these points, such as scenario-based design and contextual inquiry and interaction design and so forth. So hopefully you can think of it as just learning or gaining a few tools that you can add to your toolbox. So that's it for this week. I'll see you in the next video.